We're very pleased to have with us today Virginia Gamba, the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict. As you know, the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict is now out and is available. There's a press release is available as well on this. And Ms. Gamba is here to talk to you about this year's report, which will be presented in a meeting to the Security Council next week. Ms. Gamba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just making sure I have everything. Yes. And this is. Thank you very much for being here, and I know there are competing interests always in the UN, as it should be, because we are a global organization dealing with all kinds of crises everywhere in the world. But as you said, yesterday, 7 o'clock at night, we published the annual report of the Secretary General for Children and Conflict covering the year 2024. I'm going to read a brief statement, and then after that we can have questions, if you don't mind. I have time. At least until I think it's 11:30, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have time. So good morning. Last time I saw you a year ago, I announced that 2023 was the worst year for children affected by armed conflict since we started monitoring and verifying grave violations against children. Now I'm in front of you a year later, and I am telling you that 2024 was even worse. In 2024, we saw a 25% increase in grave violations against children. This is the third consecutive year with such alarming figures. From 32,990 verified grave violations in 2023 to 41,370 verified incidents in 2024. This is now the highest number of grave violations against children in armed conflict since the inception of the Children and Armed Conflict Mandate almost 30 years ago. The numbers cover the 25 country situations and one regional monitoring arrangement, which are included in the Children and Armed Conflict report. These violations include recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, abductions, as well as attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access to children, which are the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict as designated by the United Nations Security Council. I want to emphasize that the findings of the report were documented amid extraordinary adversity and insecurity. The year 2024 also saw a devastating record of attacks on humanitarian personnel and United Nations staff, with more personnel killed this year than ever before. Wars and armed conflict inflicted excruciating levels of violence on children. As conflicts rage across the globe, children around the world are being killed, maimed, starved, or raped. It is as if parties to war and conflict, and we, the international community, choose to settle our disputes through military means at an enormous cost for our children, rather than choosing to negotiate peace for the benefit of all our children. Indiscriminate attacks, disregard for ceasefires and peace efforts, and deepening humanitarian crisis, with a blatant disregard for international law and the rights and special protections of children by all parties to conflict, have scarred our children for life. Behind the numbers of this year's report are the shattered stories, dreams, and futures of 22,495 children, each of them profoundly affected by war, displacement, and the collapse of protection systems that should have served as their shield. This horrifying number includes 11,967 children killed or maimed as the most prevalent of all violations of 2024. Most often, these have happened because of explosive ordnance, crossfire, and anti-personnel landmines. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as well as deliberate and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, had a grim impact. Almost half of all grave violations were committed by non-state armed groups. However, governmental forces remain the principal perpetrators of killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. The second most prevalent violation was denial of humanitarian access to children, with 7,906 collective incidents of denial, and coming a third close was 7,402 children that were recruited or used in the 25 situations and one regional monitoring arrangement on the CAC agenda, which I oversee. Countries with the highest levels of violations in 2024 were Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, notably the Gaza Strip, then the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Nigeria, and Haiti. Most grave violations showed an increase in 2024, including attacks on schools, 44% increase, and rape and other forms of sexual violence, 35% increase. Here, I want to express my deep concern at the continuous increase in verified incidents of sexual violence against children, as the numbers had already increased by 25% between 2022 and 2023. Data for some countries is particularly staggering. For instance, in 2024, for Haiti alone, over 550 children were victims of sexual violence, with over 70% of these cases involving gang rape. In Nigeria, over 400 children were subjected to sexual violence, including forced marriage. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the United Nations verified that over 350 girls were subjected to sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, and sexual slavery. Excuse me. In addition, this year, the number of children victims of multiple grave violations, more than one violation per child, increased by 17% through the convergence of abduction, recruitment and use, and sexual violence, representing an alarming escalation in brutality. The situation faced by children has deteriorated in several contexts, such as Lebanon, Mozambique, and Haiti, which witnessed a sharp increase in grave violations, more than 500% in the cases of Haiti and Mozambique. I want us to pause to think for a second about what this all means. Children living amid hostilities are being robbed of their childhood. We are faced with parties to conflict who, instead of recognizing the special protection afforded to children, are blatantly ignoring international law and show little to no political will. Perhaps nowhere in the news is this more visible than in Gaza. The magnitude of the suffering of the children in Gaza defies and contravenes every human standard. We cannot continue to stand by and watch with no action. There is no justification for depriving children of access to survival means such as food, healthcare, and security. It is imperative that Israel facilitates safe, rapid, and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to civilians in need in the Gaza Strip. And it is imperative that the armed groups inside Gaza prime humanitarian relief over their political aspirations, including through the immediate release of all Israeli hostages, alive or dead. The rules of conduct in hostilities apply to each and every party in each and every conflict, and they must be respected and upheld at all times. The children of Gaza dying for lack of essential assistance and life-saving elements will stand as silent shadow witnesses to this lowest degree of inhumanity, which for sure is preventable. The report presented to you must serve as a wake-up call. I call on the international community to recommit to the universal consensus to protect children from armed conflict, and on parties to conflict to immediately end their wars, which are fought over the bodies of their own children. All parties to conflict must uphold the core principles of international humanitarian law that impose limits on the destruction and suffering caused by armed conflict: humanity, distinction, proportionality, and necessity. The report also shows that children are also, in some instances, being re-victimized. 3,018 children were detained for their actual or alleged association with parties to conflict, an increase compared to the previous year. I want to remind you that children released from armed groups or forces should be treated primarily as victims, and that alternatives to detention should be actively sought, with the best interests of the child always in mind. I call on the international community to support age and gender-appropriate reintegration programs as an indispensable element for sustainable peace. Faced with this situation, the United Nations has continued to engage to deliver progress for children affected, and close to 16,500 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups were provided with protection or reintegration support during 2024 in countries on the CAC agenda, an increase compared to 2023. This brings the total of children released from parties to conflict since 2005 to over 200,000. I want to take this opportunity to emphasize the importance of supporting the release of children from armed forces and groups, but also their reintegration. Releasing children is just the first step, and many steps must follow if we want these children to be given a real chance, a real future. We need to provide sustainable and predictable support to reintegration programs, not only for former child soldiers, but also for children released from detention and for children screened out of recruitment processes. Appropriate services and programs, including psychosocial support, healthcare, education, and livelihood opportunities, are instrumental to successful peace-building efforts. CAC engagement also bore more fruit for children, and some 40 commitments were taken by parties to conflict, including handover protocols, capacity-building initiatives, unilateral commitments, and bilateral dialogues, as well as the signature of action plans, such as the one with the opposition Syrian National Army that I signed in June 2024. Despite such progress, children have continued to suffer the consequences of man-made conflict in 2024. But this is not a time to give up. We need to redouble efforts and ensure that we have the resources and support to continue to monitor and report grave violations, provide capacity building, pursue accountability, and prevent all grave violations against children. As United Nations peace operations transitions, reconfigure, or withdraw, we must ensure that child protection frameworks are preserved and transferred in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2764. The monitoring and reporting mechanism requires reinforcement and support through predictable, flexible, and multi-year funding. Child protection must be mainstreamed across all mandates and processes, from early warning and mediation to transitional justice, security sector reform, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Because of the significantly reduced word count, our report unfortunately contains very limited examples of the suffering of the face of these children. We are thus publishing with the report a summary document which includes additional information such as comparisons, information on gender, and individual stories for each of the grave violations. It is an invitation to look beyond the numbers. I invite you to have a look at it. Before opening to questions, let me remind you that my office is working to end and prevent all grave violations against children, and we do that with a wide range of partners, member states, international and regional organizations, DPO, DPPA, and UNICEF, as well as UN agencies, funds, and programs, and their civil society partners. More specifically, I want to stress the crucial work done by child protection actors on the ground, often in extremely difficult circumstances. They often face threats daily in several country situations, and we want to express our concerns and ask all parties to allow them to do their work, which is to provide protection and life-saving aid to children affected by conflict. It is also important that the international community continues to support them. Finally, let me say that beyond the work and efforts of all partners, ultimately, the key to ending and preventing grave violations against children is peace. We must strive for peace. We must compromise and seek peace. We must do this to assist and help our children now. I am ready to take questions, but before I do, I really need to show you a short video about my campaign that the office has launched called Prove It Matters. Can we please see the short video now?
In 1989, you talked about protecting my rights. You said it was important. You adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But it feels worse now than ever before. If this message ever reaches you, we ask you to do one thing. Listen and take action.
Child, and to take immediate and concrete measures to safeguard children's rights now, not tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll now open the floor for questions. First question goes to Abdul Hamid.
This important report. I have few questions, and I hope you will have the patience to answer me, and you always do. My first question is on 21st of May, you issued a statement, strong statement, condemning the killing of 2 Israeli diplomats in Washington. They are diplomats working for Israel. It was connected to anti-Semitism, which is, I don't know how, because they were not targeted because they were Jews, but because they were working for Israeli government. I'm not condoning that. I also condemn any killing. The SG issued a strong statement, and then Mauritinos, who is in charge of this file of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, also issued a strong statement. But then you issued a statement under the banner in your capacity as an interim advisor on the Convention of the Prevention of Genocide. I'm sorry. Should I repeat? Okay. So, forgot that. I'll continue. A few days later, on 23rd, you issued a statement on the children in Gaza. It was mild, and you said, okay, that the military the prolonged military conflict had prevented humanitarian aid to enter Gaza and to be distributed, which created a humanitarian disaster, especially for children and babies. But the word condemn is not there. In your statement on the 2 killed, it was strong. You used the word condemn. You even used the 2 names who were killed. On Gaza, you issued the statement in your capacity as the representative of children in armed conflict. And the other one was in your capacity as advisor on the prevention of the crime of genocide. So I thought that is not in your mandate, but it's Mauritania's mandate and the SG. Why? How can you explain that? And can I continue with the question so you answer me one time?
Why don't we go through, have her answer this first, and then you can ask.
Okay. So.
Thank you very much, and I take the opportunity to say that as of November last year, I have been asked by the Secretary General to be the ad interim special advisor on prevention of genocide, which is a file that includes Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. I'm also the chair of the UN Working Group on Combating Hate. This week was the International Day presented by the government of Morocco for combating hate in all its forms. And I've had over 15 events this week on that issue, as well as one event yesterday in support of another office of the Secretariat, which is the Office of the Prevention of Sexual Violence in Conflict, because yesterday was the International Day to Prevent Sexual Violence. So I thank you for noting my other role. It has been very difficult to do both roles at the same time. It is very onerous. So thank you very much for noticing that I have been doing my job in both cases to the best of my ability as the situation moves. As you know very well, the 2 mandates are very different. What is required of them is something very different. I am very sorry that you felt that you had to compare them. For me, they are non-comparable. They're 2 different things done under 2 different hats with 2 different principles and 2 different mandates. So I'm sorry that you felt that you had to compare and contrast, but I hope that your next question is about children and armed conflict.
Yeah, my next question is about the numbers. And in paragraph 101, you said that 1,259 Palestinian children killed, and you distributed these killing between the West Bank and Gaza, and even the Palestinian Authority killed 2, the settlers killed 1. But the number of 1,259 is way under reported. As you know, I mean, Mr. Tom Fletcher put larger number, Lazzarini put larger number. Everyone knows that the number goes between 13,000 and 17,000. It could be more. The many children died not directly by bullets, but by famine also, or for lack of medicine. So how could you come up with this number, which is very, very low? And everyone knows that. Thank you.
I think that you've been and I've been in this room with you for many years. And every year we try to explain why the mandate of CAC is different. to anything else. Whatever we do, it can never really be contrasted or compared with what other agencies, funds, and programs do. My quick answer to you would be that you should put your questions to OCHA, to UNHCR, to OHCHR, or even to the Secretary General himself. You have to understand there's one UN. And every day, if not every week, there are figures and there are statements that come out from different bodies within the UN system, all calling attention on the same issue and on the same problem. So rather than compare us to what everybody else is doing, you have to understand how we operate. And we've explained this many, many times. The mandate is a 30-year-old mandate. It is obligated to use a specific type of verification process that has to be done according to what is called the Monitoring Reporting Mechanism Guidelines, which is a Security Council tool that we are obliged to do. Now, who does that in the field? It is officers of the UN that are trained on monitoring, reporting, verification processes. This is ongoing. I think I'm actually very proud of the UN monitors on the ground, because I've never seen them make so many verifications and the attempt of so many verifications over the last 2 years, particularly in Gaza, as they have been able to do at great cost to themselves, with very limited access and with very little resources. What other agencies do is normally talking about a situation of their purview, which includes, if you are a World Food Program, you talk about that. If you are UNICEF, you talk about that. If you are about refugees, you talk about that. And you ask and you plead always for the same thing, with this access and more support from the international community and more support from Israel to allow these systems to get through to the children. So, as relates to denial of humanitarian access, as you know, in our mandate, it's not a listable violation, but we nevertheless do a big effort to verify, according to the MRM guidelines, every one of the reports we get. It does not mean, and it never has meant, that the figures that we present are what there is. It is always the verified minimum that our monitors can produce that year. They continue to monitor and verify every year. That's why the report also says, if you look at it, that there's more than 1,000 late verifications that were conducted last year, aside from the verifications that actually occurred in 2024. I have no doubt that with time, we will be able to catch up and be able to attest and verify that every one of these violations was committed, and we will be able to identify every perpetrator of these violations. So I cannot answer you in any other way, but I want to say that you are correct in that Gaza has been one of the most important situations repeatedly for a couple of years now. And it has shown really horrible levels of suffering, particularly for children. In the figures of this year, the 41,179 violations worldwide, Gaza alone is about 20% of that figure. Thank you.
Just two short questions. I don't want to take all your time. One question is why the Israeli settlers were not included in the list of non-state actors violators. And the second, have you tried again to visit Gaza if you were prevented or if you even did not try? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you will notice again on the reports, and not just last year, but for several years now, we have made it a point to try to identify different perpetrators. It would be, relatively easy if we didn't do our work well and we just blanketed one side and another side and we put everything behind it. But we believe very strongly that if we have to engage to change behavior and conduct, and we have to try to persuade to engage in some type of action to stop violations, we need to be able to identify the perpetrators. And the settlers have been already identified, not just settlers. There's a number of other bodies, including civilians, communities, that have now been identified, and the numbers as identified and verified are in the annual report. The decisions on listing of different parties rest solely with the Secretary General. So he has the same figures that you have, that we have produced, and at this point in time, the only listed party in Israel is the Israeli Security and Defense Forces, which is a broad array of government forces. But there is a specific mention when the monitors were able to identify other groups, such as the settlers. As to my issue of the visit of Gaza, I have offered many times to go to Gaza, many times. But you have to understand, this is a one UN system. I am an Undersecretary General. When I travel, I require, and it is specific for the protocol of a traveling Undersecretary General, that there must be certain security conditions as well as certain protocols, visas, etc. When there's a tragedy of the size of the one that we're seeing in Gaza over the last 2-3 years, then the whole of the UN must engage. And it is the UN itself, I would say, at the level of the highest level of the UN, that organizes itself so as to prime the visits of different USGs at the same time, so that very few times more than one is in the room or in the field at the same time as another one. In my case, I tried and I offered 4 times to go to Gaza. Every time it was not so much a situation of visas being denied, which in some cases they were, but more importantly in being asked to allow some of my colleagues to prime their visits over mine. And I accepted. Perhaps I should not have accepted. But at the time, and you know the way the UN works, we prime the humanitarian above the political always. And the needs are such that always, that was what the coordinator of the UN on the humanitarian assistance recommended. And I follow the recommendations of the system. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And with that, I would like once more to thank Virginia Gamba, the Secretary General's Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict. Thank you, especially over all these years, for all these great briefings and reports. We really all appreciate them. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I will not miss you. I am going to my retirement with a peace of mind. Thank you.
Thanks so much for everything.